Hi, I'm Valerie Hartwell. 3 months ago, I discovered my parents had secretly sold the coastal property my grandfather left me in his will. They thought they were clever, liquidating 50 acres of Oregon coastline worth $3 million, while I was buried in case files 3 states away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They celebrated at dinner parties, bragging about their shrewd business move to family friends who nodded approvingly over wine and cheese. What they didn't realize was that my grandfather, a former maritime lawyer, had embedded a clause so ironclad in that inheritance that their betrayal would become their financial ruin. Tonight, I'm not just telling you about family greed. I'm showing you how one overlooked legal provision brought down an empire built on lies. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown Portland loft, each drop sounding like tiny bullets against the glass. It was one of those October evenings where the Pacific Northwest showed its teeth, the kind of storm that made you grateful for solid walls and central heating. I'd just returned from a grueling 3-day deposition in Seattle, representing a maritime shipping company against a cargo insurance claim. My briefcase sat heavy by the door, stuffed with contracts and testimonies that would determine millions in liability. I peeled off my rain-soaked coat, hanging it carefully on the vintage brass hook by the entrance. The warmth of my apartment wrapped around me like a comfortable embrace after the day's corporate warfare. My loft occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in Portland's Pearl District, with exposed brick walls and industrial fixtures that reminded me daily that I'd built this life from scratch. No family money, no inherited connections, just law school debt and the stubborn determination my grandfather had instilled in me during those long summer afternoons in his cluttered study. The mail lay scattered across my kitchen island where I'd dropped it that morning, bills and legal journals mixed with the usual array of promotional materials. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, the good stuff I saved for particularly brutal weeks, and began sorting through the stack with mechanical precision. Electric bill, bar association newsletter, invitation to a colleague's retirement party. Then my fingers froze around an envelope that made my blood run cold. It was addressed, in my mother's careful script, the kind of penmanship they taught in finishing schools back when such things mattered. The return address showed our family's Cannon Beach house, the sprawling coastal estate where I'd spent every summer of my childhood. But it wasn't a letter. It was a real estate closing document, official and legal and utterly devastating. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope, papers spilling across the granite countertop like evidence in a crime scene. Sale agreement, deed transfer, final closing statement. All for the 50-acre coastal property that had been in our family for 4 generations, the inheritance my grandfather had specifically left to me in his meticulously detailed will. The buyer was listed as Pacific Luxury Developments, a name I didn't recognize, but that screamed of the kind of corporation that turned family legacies into shopping centers. The sale price stared back at me from the closing documents, $3.2 million. My inheritance, sold without my knowledge. Or consent, the money already transferred to my parents' accounts according to the banking statements tucked behind the deed. I sank onto the leather bar stool, the room spinning slightly as the magnitude of the betrayal settled into my bones. My phone rang, cutting through the silence like a scream. The caller ID showed my mother's contact information, her smiling face, from last Christmas dinner mocking me from the screen. I let it ring twice before answering, my voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos of emotions churning in my chest. "Valerie, darling," came her voice, sweet as poisoned honey. "I hope you received our little package today." "Your little package?" I repeated, staring at the scattered documents. "You mean the proof that you sold my inheritance behind my back?" A pause. Then that familiar laugh she used when she thought she was being particularly clever. "Oh, sweetheart, don't be so dramatic. It wasn't really yours yet, was it? Daddy and I are still alive, after all. We simply made an executive decision about family assets that were sitting there doing nothing but costing us property taxes. The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow. I'd expected many things from my parents over the years, but outright theft hadn't been one of them. Mother, grandfather's will was explicit. That property was left to me directly, not to the family estate. You had no legal right to sell it. Legal right, she scoffed, and I could picture her waving her manicured hand dismissively. Darling, your grandfather was an old man when he wrote that will. Clearly, his intentions were that the property should benefit the family as a whole. Preston agrees completely. Of course, Preston agreed. My older brother had never met a family decision he wouldn't support if it benefited him financially. As the golden child who'd followed our father into investment banking, Preston had always been the heir apparent to everything the Hartwell name represented. My choice to become a maritime attorney, working with shipping companies and dock workers, instead of country club members, had been viewed as a charming rebellion that I'd eventually outgrow. Preston doesn't get a vote in this, I said, my voice gaining steel. And neither do you. That property was mine. Was, she agreed cheerfully, but now it's been sold, and the money is being put to much better use. Preston's expanding his portfolio, and your father's considering a second home in Scottsdale. Much more practical than letting good real estate sit empty 9 months of the year. I closed my eyes, remembering those empty months she referenced. Every fall through spring, when the tourist season ended and the Oregon coast returned to its wild, untamed beauty. Those had been my favorite times at the property, when I could walk the rocky beaches alone and feel connected to something larger than quarterly profit reports and client billable hours. My grandfather had understood that connection. He'd seen how I'd inherited his love for the ocean, his respect for the maritime traditions that had built our family's fortune 3 generations ago. I'm going to fight this, I said quietly. Another laugh, more condescending this time. With what, darling? The sale is complete, the papers are filed. You could hire every lawyer in Portland and it wouldn't change the fact that Preston and your father have power of attorney over family assets during any periods of uncertainty. Uncertainty? Well, you have been under such stress lately, haven't you? All those late nights, working yourself to exhaustion. We've been worried about your mental state, frankly. Several family friends have mentioned how thin you've looked, how scattered you seem at social gatherings. It's only natural that we'd want to protect family interests during such a difficult time. The implication hit me like ice water. They weren't just stealing my inheritance, they were painting me as mentally unfit to challenge the theft. I could see the strategy clearly, probably Preston's idea given his background in financial manipulation. Create a narrative about my instability, use it to justify taking control of assets, then present the sale as a fait accompli that no court would overturn. You're making a mistake, I said, each word carefully measured. A bigger mistake than you realize. The only mistake would be letting sentiment cloud good business judgment, my mother replied. Your grandfather was a lovely man, but his romantic notions about keeping every scrap of family property indefinitely simply aren't practical in today's economy. The property has been sold, Valerie. It's time to accept that and move forward. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me alone with the scattered documents and the sound of rain against the windows. I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, bourbon forgotten, as the full scope of their betrayal crystallized in my mind. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about erasing the one connection I'd had to the grandfather who'd shaped my understanding of justice, integrity, and the kind of lawyer I wanted to be. Thomas Hartwell had been a maritime attorney back when Portland was still a rough-edged port city before gentrification turned the waterfront into boutique hotels and artisanal coffee shops. He'd represented dock workers and fishing crews, fought for fair wages and safe working conditions, when such causes weren't profitable or popular. The coastal property had been his sanctuary, the place where he'd go to think and plan and remember why the law mattered beyond profit margins. I'd spent countless hours in his study during those childhood summers, listening to him explain the intricacies of maritime law while ocean fog rolled in through the open windows. He'd taught me that the law wasn't just about winning cases or billing hours. It was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, about standing between the powerful and the powerless when the balance tipped too far toward injustice. "The ocean doesn't care about your bank account or your social connections," he'd told me once, watching waves crash against the rocks below his study window. "It only cares about respect. Show it respect, and it'll teach you everything you need to know about power and patience." Now that sanctuary was gone, sold to developers who'd probably tear down his carefully preserved study and replace it with condominiums marketed to wealthy retirees. The thought of strangers walking through rooms where I'd learned to love the law made my chest tight with a grief I hadn't expected. But grief would have to wait. I was a maritime attorney, trained in the kind of complex legal frameworks that governed shipping lanes and coastal properties. If my parents thought they could outmaneuver me with simple power of attorney documents and claims about my mental state, they'd clearly forgotten who had taught me to read contracts in the first place. I gathered up the scattered papers, organizing them into neat piles on my dining table. Sale agreement, deed transfer, closing statement, banking records. Everything looked legitimate on the surface, the kind of clean transaction that would hold up in most courts. But maritime law was different from regular real estate law, especially when it came to coastal properties with specific usage rights and environmental protections. My grandfather's will had been a masterpiece of legal precision, drafted by a man who understood that family members might someday challenge his wishes. I'd read it carefully when he died 5 years ago, making note of the unusual clauses and provisions that seemed almost paranoid in their thoroughness. At the time, I'd assumed he was simply being cautious. Now I realized he'd been preparing for exactly this scenario. The will was stored in my office safe, along with other important family documents my grandfather had specifically entrusted to me rather than to my parents or Preston. I'd thought it was because of my legal background, a professional courtesy, from one attorney to another. But as I drove through the rain-slicked streets toward my office building, I began to suspect his motivations had been more personal than professional. The Hartwell and Associates building stood dark and empty at this hour, rain streaming down its glass facade like tears. I'd joined the firm straight out of law school, drawn by their reputation in maritime law and their willingness to take on cases that bigger firms considered too specialized or unprofitable. My nameplate still read associate, but I'd been carrying partner-level responsibility for 2 years now, ever since the senior partners had recognized that my grandfather's connections and knowledge had died with him. My office occupied a corner of the 3rd floor, with windows overlooking the Willamette River and the industrial bridges that connected Portland's east and west sides. The view reminded me daily of the city's maritime heritage, the shipping routes, and river commerce that had built the Pacific Northwest's economy one cargo container at a time. The safe sat behind a reproduction of my grandfather's favorite maritime painting, a stormy seascape that had hung in his study for as long as I could remember. Inside, carefully preserved in fireproof filing folders, were the documents that constituted his life's legal work: contracts, correspondence, property deeds, and at the very back, his last will and testament. I spread the will across my desk, scanning the familiar language with new eyes. The property bequest was clear and unambiguous. The 50-acre coastal estate was left directly to me, along with all buildings, improvements, and associated rights. But it was the associated rights clause that made my pulse quicken as I read it more carefully. Maritime access rights, historical usage protections, environmental conservation easements, and buried in the middle of a paragraph about property, maintenance responsibilities, a provision that made my breath catch in my throat. said property shall remain in the beneficial ownership of Valerie Hartwell in perpetuity, subject to maritime law provisions regarding coastal property succession and the continuing obligations of the Hartwell Maritime Trust, established 1952, which shall remain in effect regardless of any subsequent property transfers, sales, or attempted conveyances. The Hartwell Maritime Trust. I'd heard my grandfather mention it in passing over the years, but I'd assumed it was some obsolete legal entity from the family's shipping business days. Now, reading the will more carefully, I realized it was the key to everything. The coastal property wasn't just real estate. It was the physical anchor for a maritime trust that had been operating continuously for over 70 years. I pulled out my laptop and began researching, diving into maritime law databases and historical property records with the focused intensity that had made me one of Portland's most respected young attorneys. What I found made my hands shake as I typed notes and cross-referenced legal precedents. The Hartwell Maritime Trust hadn't been dissolved when the family sold their shipping business in the 1980s. It had continued operating as a legal entity, with specific provisions about coastal property ownership and succession. According to maritime law, properties held in such trusts couldn't be sold without the explicit consent of all beneficiaries, regardless of any power of attorney arrangements or claims about mental fitness. More importantly, any attempt to sell trust property illegally triggered automatic penalties that included full restitution plus punitive damages calculated according to maritime commerce rates. The developers who'd bought the property weren't just purchasing real estate. They were unknowingly accepting liability for a trust violation that could cost them triple the purchase price. My parents and Preston had sold property they legally couldn't sell to buyers who would soon discover they'd purchased a massive legal liability instead of a profitable development opportunity. The maritime trust provisions were so obscure that most real estate attorneys wouldn't even know to look for them, but they were also so ironclad that no court in the country would overturn them once properly invoked. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the river where cargo ships moved like sleeping giants through the darkness. My grandfather had been even more thorough than I'd realized, embedding protections within protections until his final wishes were virtually unassailable. He'd known his family well enough to anticipate their greed, and he'd prepared accordingly. The rain had stopped while I worked, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming under the streetlights. I gathered up the documents, making copies of everything before returning the originals to the safe. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of invoking the maritime trust provisions and unwinding the illegal sale. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. My parents thought they'd outsmarted me, that they could steal my inheritance and cover their tracks with claims about my mental state and their legal authority over family assets. They'd celebrated their clever manipulation, probably toasting their success over dinner at the country club where such victories were considered evidence of superior breeding and business acumen. What they hadn't counted on was that their daughter had inherited more than just her grandfather's love of the ocean. She'd also inherited his understanding of maritime law, his patience in planning legal strategies, and his absolute commitment to justice regardless of the personal cost. The developers who'd bought my property were about to discover that they'd walked into a legal trap that would cost them everything. My parents were about to learn that stealing from a maritime attorney was considerably more dangerous than they'd anticipated, and Preston was about to find out that his little sister had grown into the kind of opponent who could dismantle his carefully constructed financial empire with the same precision he'd used to build it. As I locked up my office and walked back to my car, I thought about my grandfather's favorite saying, "The ocean doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about your actions." My family was about to discover exactly what that meant in a court of law. The first call came at 6:30 the next morning, jolting me from the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. My phone vibrated against the nightstand with the insistence of an emergency, and I fumbled for it in the pre-dawn darkness of my bedroom. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Miss Hartwell, This is Detective Ray Morrison with the Portland Police Bureau. I'm calling about a report we received regarding some family property dispute. Your parents have expressed concerns about your recent behavior and asked us to conduct a wellness check. I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. The morning light filtering through my bedroom windows cast everything in shades of gray, matching the cold dread that settled in my stomach. A wellness check? What kind of concerns? They mentioned you've been acting erratically, making threats, about property that doesn't belong to you. They're worried you might be having some kind of breakdown. Standard procedure is to verify that you're safe and in control of your faculties. The strategy was becoming clear now, and I had to admire its calculated precision even as it made my blood boil. My parents weren't content to simply steal my inheritance. They were systematically destroying my credibility to prevent any legal challenge. A police wellness check would create an official record of mental health concerns, documentation they could use in court to support their power of attorney claims. Detective Morrison, I'm a practicing attorney with Hartwell and Associates. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. My parents are attempting to interfere with my professional life because I've discovered they illegally sold property that belonged to me. That may be, ma'am, but I still need to complete the wellness check. Can you meet me at your office this morning? Say around 9 o'clock? I agreed, knowing that resistance would only fuel their narrative about my instability. After hanging up, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, processing the full scope of what my family was attempting. This wasn't just theft. It was character assassination designed to prevent me from fighting back. They were betting that I'd be too humiliated or intimidated to pursue legal action once they'd publicly questioned my mental fitness. The shower. Water ran scalding hot as I planned my response, steam fogging the glass doors of my bathroom. If they wanted to play psychological warfare, they'd picked the wrong opponent. Maritime law had taught me patience, but it had also taught me that sometimes the only way to stop a hostile takeover was to strike back with overwhelming force. I dressed carefully for the meeting with Detective Morrison, choosing a conservative navy suit that projected competence and stability. My reflection in the full-length mirror showed exactly what I intended: a successful attorney in complete control of her faculties and her circumstances. Let them try to paint this woman as unstable. The drive to my office took me through the heart of Portland's downtown district, past the federal courthouse where I'd argued cases and the upscale restaurants where I'd negotiated settlements over lunch. This was my territory, built through years of hard work and careful reputation management. My parents might have underestimated many things about me, but they'd clearly forgotten that I'd been practicing law in this city long enough to have allies of my own. Detective Morrison was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, a middle-aged man with graying temples and the kind of patient demeanor that came from years of dealing with family disputes. He stood when I approached, extending his hand with professional courtesy. Miss Hartwell, thanks for meeting with me on short notice. I know these family situations can be delicate. Detective, I appreciate you taking the time to handle this properly. I'm sure once you understand the actual circumstances, you'll see that my parents' concerns are unfounded. We rode the elevator to my office in comfortable silence, and I used the time to study his expression. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to the facts rather than simply validating my parents' story, which was encouraging. Police officers dealt with enough genuine mental health crises to recognize the difference between someone having a breakdown and someone responding rationally to being victimized. My office looked exactly as it should: organized, professional, and inhabited by someone clearly in control of her life. Legal briefs were neatly stacked on my desk, law books lined the shelves in perfect order, and my diplomas hung precisely aligned on the wall behind my chair. Detective Morrison took it all in with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading environments for signs of instability. Your parents mentioned you've been making claims about property that was sold legally. They're concerned you might be experiencing some kind of delusion about ownership rights. I opened my desk drawer and withdrew the copies I'd made of my grandfather's will and the maritime trust documents, spreading them across the polished wood surface with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. Detective, I'm a maritime attorney specializing in coastal property law. These documents prove that my parents sold property they had no legal right to convey. He studied the papers carefully, reading with the thoroughness of someone who understood that family disputes often hinged on legal technicalities that seemed minor to outsiders, but were crucial to the parties involved. I watched his expression change as he absorbed the implications of what he was reading. This is pretty complex stuff, he admitted after several minutes. Maritime trusts, coastal property rights, succession provisions. You're saying your parents didn't have the authority to sell this property? Exactly. The property was held in a maritime trust that's been in continuous operation since 1952. Under maritime law, trust property can't be sold without the explicit consent of all beneficiaries, regardless of any power of attorney arrangements. My parents not only lacked the authority to sell, they've exposed themselves and the buyers to significant legal liability. Detective Morrison closed the folder and sat back in his chair, his assessment of the situation clearly shifting. Miss Hartwell, I have to ask directly. Are you planning to take any action against your parents or the property buyers that might involve harassment or intimidation? I'm planning to file a lawsuit to void the illegal sale and recover damages as provided under maritime law. Everything I do will be through proper legal channels with full documentation and court oversight. He nodded, making notes in his small notebook. That's what I needed to hear. Based on this conversation and what I've seen here today, I don't have any concerns about your mental state or your ability to handle your affairs. I'll file a report stating that the wellness check found no evidence of instability or threat to yourself or others. After he left, I sat alone in my office, feeling the first stirrings of something that had been absent since I'd discovered the theft. Genuine confidence that I could win this fight. My parents had overplayed their hand by involving the police. Instead of creating documentation of mental instability, they generated an official record of my competence and rationality. The detective's report would actually strengthen my position, if this ended up in court. But I wasn't ready to file lawsuits yet. Maritime law had taught me that the most devastating attacks were often the ones your opponent never saw coming, and I had a feeling my family's vulnerability ran deeper than just the illegal property sale. If they were willing to steal from me and destroy my reputation to cover their tracks, what else might they be hiding? The answer came sooner than I expected, in the form of a phone call from Zara Patel, my closest friend since law school, and now one of Portland's most sought-after forensic accountants. Zara specialized in unraveling complex financial schemes for divorce attorneys and corporate investigators, and she had a talent for finding hidden assets that rivaled her ability to trace money laundering operations. Val, I got your message about running some background checks on your family's finances. Girl, you need to sit down for this conversation. Us? I could hear the excitement in her voice, the tone she got when she'd uncovered something particularly juicy in a client's financial records. Zara loved the hunt almost as much as she loved the revelation, and she'd clearly found something worth her enthusiasm. What did you dig up? Your brother Preston's investment firm is in serious trouble. I mean, facing federal investigation-level trouble. The SEC has been quietly looking into some of his client accounts for the past 6 months, and from what I can piece together, he's been using family assets as collateral for increasingly risky investments. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the implications hit me. Family assets, including the coastal property? That's where it gets interesting. The property sale wasn't just theft, Val. It was Preston desperately trying to cover his ass before the feds froze his accounts. He needed clean money, fast, and your inheritance was the only asset he could access without triggering automatic reporting requirements. I closed my eyes, feeling pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The timing of the sale, my parents' sudden interest in managing family assets, their preemptive strike against my credibility. It wasn't just greed, it was panic. Preston had gotten himself into financial trouble so deep that he was willing to destroy his sister to dig himself out. How bad is it? Bad enough that your parents probably mortgaged their own house to cover some of his losses. I found records of a second mortgage taken out 3 months ago, right around the time the SEC investigation started heating up. Your whole family is leveraged to the hilt, and they're using your inheritance as their escape hatch. The revelation transformed my understanding of the entire situation. This wasn't just about stealing my property. It was about using my inheritance to fund Preston's financial crimes and cover the family's mounting debts. They hadn't just betrayed me, they'd turned me into an unwitting accomplice in whatever scheme had attracted federal attention. Zara, I need you to document everything you found. Every transaction, every mortgage, every connection between Preston's business and the property sale. If this is heading toward federal charges, I want to make sure I'm on the right side of the investigation. Already on it. I've got copies of everything, and I'm preparing a comprehensive report that'll show exactly how the money flowed from your inheritance to Preston's accounts to whatever black hole he's been throwing cash into. After hanging up, I sat in my office staring out at the Willamette River, watching cargo ships navigate the complex currents that had shaped Portland's maritime economy for over a century. My grandfather had always said that the river was like family. It could lift you up or drag you down, depending on whether you understood its true nature. Now I understood my family's true nature, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. They weren't just thieves. They were desperate thieves willing to destroy anyone who threatened their survival. The wellness check, the claims about my mental state, the dismissive attitude about my legal rights. It was all designed to keep me quiet while they used my inheritance to cover Preston's crimes. But they'd made a crucial mistake in their desperation. By involving federal investigators and creating a paper trail of financial manipulation, they'd opened themselves up to consequences far beyond anything I could have achieved through a simple property dispute. The maritime trust violation was serious, but federal fraud charges were catastrophic. My phone rang again, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed my father's office number, and I considered letting it go to voicemail before deciding that I wanted to hear what he had to say now that the police had cleared me of mental instability. Valerie, we need to talk. His voice carried the authoritative tone he'd used throughout my childhood, the assumption that his word was final and his decisions were unquestionable. This nonsense about the property has gone far enough. Has it? Because I'm just getting started. A pause, then a shift to the more conciliatory tone he used when he needed something. Look, sweetheart, I know you're upset about the sale, but you have to understand the bigger picture. Preston's business has had some challenges lately, and we needed to consolidate family assets to protect everyone's interests. Everyone's interests except mine. Your interests are our interests, Valerie. We're family. What benefits one of us benefits all of us. The familiar refrain that had justified every unfair decision throughout my childhood, every time Preston had been chosen over me, every time my achievements had been minimized in favor of his potential. Family unity as a weapon against individual justice. Dad, I know about the SEC investigation. I know about the second mortgage on your house. I know this isn't about consolidating assets. It's about covering up Preston's crimes with my inheritance. The silence stretched so long, I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth. You don't understand the complexities of what Preston is dealing with. Sometimes in business, you have to make difficult decisions to protect the larger interests. Difficult decisions like fraud, like using family property as collateral for illegal investments, like stealing from your own daughter to pay for your son's mistakes. Preston hasn't done anything illegal. He's made some investments that haven't worked out as planned, but that's not the same as criminal activity. The SEC investigation is routine, just bureaucrats looking for problems where none exist. I laughed, a sound that carried no humor. Dad, I'm a lawyer. I know the difference between a routine investigation and a criminal probe, and I know that using stolen property to cover investment losses is definitely illegal, regardless of what Preston's been telling you. The property wasn't stolen. We had every right to make decisions about family assets when you were clearly not in a stable condition to handle such responsibilities. Stable condition? The police officer who conducted the wellness check filed a report stating that I'm perfectly competent and rational. Would you like me to send you a copy? Another pause, and I could almost hear him reassessing the situation. The police report would undermine their mental health narrative, making it much harder to justify their actions in court. Without the instability claim, they'd be forced to defend the property sale on its legal merits, which they couldn't do. Valerie, what do you want? What's it going to take to resolve this situation amicably? The question revealed everything about his mindset. He still thought this was a negotiation, that I could be bought off or persuaded to accept a smaller loss in exchange for family. Peace. He didn't understand that I wasn't just fighting for property anymore. I was fighting for the principle that family ties didn't give anyone the right to steal from their own children. I want my property back. I want full documentation of how the sale proceeds were used, and I want Preston to face the consequences of whatever financial crimes he's committed without using my inheritance as his escape fund. That's not reasonable, and you know it. The sale is complete, the money has been invested, and Preston's business issues are private family matters that don't concern you. They concern me when my inheritance is being used to fund them, and they'll concern the FBI when I provide them with documentation of how stolen property was used to cover up federal crimes. The line went dead. My father had hung up rather than continue a conversation he couldn't control, which told me everything I needed to know about how desperate their situation had become. They'd moved beyond attempting to manipulate me and were now in full damage, control mode. I immediately called Zara back, asking her to accelerate her investigation and prepare a comprehensive report that would document every aspect of the financial scheme. If my family wanted to play hardball, I was ready to show them what a maritime attorney could do when she stopped worrying about family harmony and focused entirely on legal justice. The rest of the afternoon was spent researching federal whistleblower protections and the procedures for reporting financial crimes to the appropriate authorities. If Preston was using my inheritance to cover up SEC violations, then I had not. Only the right, but the responsibility to expose the scheme before it caused even more damage. As evening approached, I found myself back at my apartment, staring out at the city lights reflecting off the river like scattered stars. My phone had been quiet since my father hung up, which probably meant the family was having an emergency, meeting to discuss their next move. They were learning what I'd known since childhood, that when you corner someone with nothing left to lose, they become infinitely more dangerous than when they're simply fighting for advantage. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of destroying everything they'd built on the foundation of my stolen inheritance. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel the satisfaction of knowing that my grandfather's lessons about patience and justice were about to be vindicated in ways he never could have imagined. The ocean doesn't care about your intentions, only your actions. And my family was about to discover that their actions had consequences they were completely unprepared to face. The Cannon Beach morning was crisp and clear when I arrived at my grandfather's former property, now legally owned by Pacific Luxury Developments, but still holding the ghosts of 4 generations of Hartwell family memories. I'd driven down from Portland before dawn, wanting to walk the grounds one final time before I triggered the legal avalanche that would reclaim it. The security fence was new, installed by the developers, but the old service gate still used the same combination my grandfather had taught me 20 years ago. Inside the perimeter, the property looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the surveyor's stakes and construction equipment that marked where luxury condominiums would soon replace the weathered cedar buildings that had housed my childhood. Summers. The main house stood empty, its windows boarded up pending demolition, but my grandfather's study remained untouched in the building's eastern wing. I used the hidden key he'd shown me during my last visit, still tucked under the loose floorboard of the wraparound porch. The study door opened with the familiar creak that had announced my presence during countless summer afternoons, and I stepped into a room that time had frozen in amber. His massive oak desk still dominated the space, covered with maritime charts and legal journals exactly as he'd left them. The scent of salt air and old leather bindings transported me instantly back to those long afternoons when he'd explained the intricacies of maritime law, while ocean waves provided a constant backdrop. Behind his desk, the wall-mounted safe remained exactly where it had always been, hidden behind the framed photograph of the cargo ship that had launched our family's fortune in the 1920s. I'd watched him open it hundreds of times during those summer visits, memorizing the combination without realizing I was doing so. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather to protect them from coastal moisture, were the original documents that would prove devastating to everyone who'd participated in the illegal sale. The Hartwell Maritime Trust Charter, established in 1952, was even more comprehensive than I'd realized from reading the copies in my Portland office. My grandfather hadn't just created a legal entity to protect coastal property. He'd built a fortress of interlocking provisions that made the trust virtually indestructible. Maritime salvage rights, historical preservation requirements, environmental conservation easements, and buried deep in the appendices, penalty clauses that would bankrupt anyone who violated the trust's terms. More importantly, I found correspondence between my grandfather and federal maritime authorities that established the trust's property as a designated marine sanctuary with specific protections under federal environmental law. Any development that disturbed the coastal ecosystem would trigger automatic penalties from both the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Commerce's Marine Protection Division. Pacific Luxury Developments hadn't just bought illegally conveyed property. They'd purchased a federal environmental violation that would cost them millions in fines before they could build a single condominium. The penalty calculations were staggering, based on maritime commerce rates that assumed coastal property had the same value as deep-water shipping lanes. My grandfather had been brilliantly thorough in protecting his legacy. The morning sun was streaming through the study windows when my phone buzzed with a call from Kieran O'Sullivan, an investigative journalist I'd met 6 months earlier during a complex shipping insurance case. Kieran specialized in financial crime reporting, with a particular talent for unraveling white-collar schemes that involved multiple jurisdictions. I'd given him Zara's preliminary findings about Preston's SEC troubles, hoping he might uncover additional information that could strengthen my position. "Valerie, you need to see what I've found about your brother's business. Can you meet me? In Portland this afternoon? This is bigger than just SEC violations." The drive back to Portland gave me time to process everything I'd discovered at the property, combining it with what Kieran had apparently uncovered about Preston's financial crimes. By the time I reached the city, I'd formulated a strategy that would address both the property theft and the underlying criminal activity that had motivated it. Kieran was waiting at a coffee shop in the Pearl District, laptop open and surrounded by printed documents that suggested he'd been working through the night. His reputation for thorough investigation was well-deserved, and the intensity in his eyes told me he'd found something significant. "Your brother Preston has been running a Ponzi scheme disguised as a high-yield investment fund," he said without preamble. "He's been paying early investors with money from later investors and using family assets as collateral to keep the scheme solvent when new investments slowed down." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd suspected something similar based on Zara's findings. A Ponzi scheme was federal fraud of the most serious kind, carrying decades of prison time and complete asset forfeiture. Preston hadn't just made bad investments. He'd committed crimes that would destroy not only his own future, but potentially implicate anyone who'd knowingly assisted him. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 3 years, possibly longer." The SEC investigation started when some of his larger investors complained about delayed payments and inconsistent returns. He's been using increasingly desperate measures to keep money flowing, including the sale of your inheritance. Kieran spread out financial documents that showed the flow of money from the property sale directly into Preston's investment accounts, then out to investors who were demanding their returns. The paper trail was damning, creating a clear connection between the theft of my inheritance and the funding of federal crimes. "There's more," Kieran continued. "Your parents aren't just passive victims in this. They've been active participants, using their personal assets as collateral and recruiting their social network as investors. Half the Riverside Country Club has money tied up in Preston's fund." The scope of the scheme was breathtaking in its audacity. Preston had turned family relationships and social connections into a criminal enterprise, using the Hartwell name's reputation to lure investors into what amounted to an elaborate theft. My parents hadn't just enabled his crimes, they'd been essential partners in executing them. "The FBI is preparing to make arrests," Kieran said quietly. "I've been told by sources inside the investigation that warrants will be served within the next 2 weeks. When that happens, every asset connected to the scheme will be frozen, including your parents' house and any remaining funds from the property sale." I stared at the documents spread across the coffee shop table, feeling the full weight of my family's destruction settling around me like fog rolling in from the ocean. Within 2 weeks, my parents and brother would be facing federal charges that could send them to prison for decades. Their social standing, their financial security, their entire carefully constructed lives would be obliterated by their own greed and desperation. "Kieran, I need you to help me make sure that when the arrests happen, it's clear that I was a victim of the scheme rather than a participant. I don't want there to be any question about my role in this. Already working on it. I've documented the timeline showing that you only discovered the property theft recently, and I've got Detective Morrison's wellness check report proving that you were acting rationally in response to discovering the crime. You're clearly a victim, not a co-conspirator." We spent the next 2 hours going through every document, every financial transaction, every piece of evidence that would establish my innocence while documenting my family's guilt. Kieran was preparing an exposé that would run in the Portland Tribune the day after the FBI arrests, ensuring that the public narrative would focus on the scope of the fraud, rather than speculation about family involvement. As we worked, I found myself thinking about my grandfather's study and the maritime trust documents I'd retrieved that morning. The trust provisions would not only void the illegal property sale, but would also create additional federal violations that could extend my family's prison sentences. Environmental law carried its own penalties, separate from financial fraud, and the combination would be devastating. That evening, I returned to my apartment with a clearer understanding of the legal strategy I needed to pursue. Rather than simply filing a civil lawsuit to recover my property, I would coordinate with federal investigators to ensure that all crimes were prosecuted simultaneously. The property recovery would happen automatically once the fraud charges were filed, and the additional environmental violations would guarantee that Pacific Luxury Developments faced their own criminal liability. My phone rang as I was reviewing the trust documents one final time, checking every provision to ensure I understood the full scope of protections my grandfather had created. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code suggested it was local. "Miss Hartwell, this is Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's Portland field office. I understand you have information relevant to our investigation of Preston Hartwell's investment activities." The moment I'd been anticipating had arrived sooner than expected. Federal agents were ready to move forward with the prosecution, and they wanted to ensure they had complete information about all aspects of the criminal scheme, including the property theft that had funded it. "Agent Chen, I have extensive documentation about the illegal sale of property that was used to fund my brother's Ponzi scheme. I also have evidence of additional federal violations that occurred during the sale process. We'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning to review everything you've gathered. Can you come to our offices at 9 o'clock? I agreed, knowing that the meeting would mark the beginning of the end for my family's criminal enterprise. Everything, I'd discovered over the past week would be turned over to federal prosecutors who had the resources and authority to unravel the full scope of Preston's fraud. The maritime trust violations would add additional charges that could extend everyone's prison sentences by years. That night I barely slept, my mind cycling through the events that had brought me to this point. A week ago, I'd been a successful maritime attorney focused on shipping insurance cases and coastal property disputes. Now I was preparing to testify against my own family in a federal criminal case that would destroy everything they'd built, over 3 generations. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching my mood as I prepared for the FBI meeting. I dressed in my most conservative suit, gathered all the documentary evidence I'd collected, and drove through Portland's morning traffic toward the federal building where my family's fate would be decided. Agent Chen met me in the lobby, a composed woman in her 40s with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested years of experience investigating white-collar crime. She led me through security checkpoints and up to a conference room where 2 other agents were waiting with laptops and recording equipment. Ms. Hartwell, we appreciate you coming forward with this information. Financial fraud cases often depend on victims being willing to cooperate with our investigation, and your documentation will be crucial to proving the scope of your brother's crimes. I spent the next 3 hours walking them through every aspect of the property theft, the maritime trust violations, and the connection between the illegal sale and Preston's Ponzi scheme. The agents took detailed notes, made copies of every document I'd brought, and asked pointed questions that revealed how thoroughly they'd already investigated the financial aspects of the case. The environmental violations are particularly serious, Agent Chen explained after reviewing the maritime trust documents. Federal environmental law carries criminal penalties separate from the fraud charges, and the developers who purchase the property will face their own liability for attempting to violate marine sanctuary protections. By the time the meeting concluded, I'd provided enough evidence to support multiple federal charges against Preston, my parents, and Pacific Luxury Developments. The maritime trust violations alone would void the property sale and trigger penalty payments that would bankrupt everyone involved. Combined with the fraud charges, the case would likely result in decades of prison time and complete asset forfeiture. As I left the federal building, I felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I'd finally exposed the full scope of my family's betrayal, and sadness that it had come to this. My grandfather had always said that the law was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, but I'd never imagined I'd need that protection from my own family. The afternoon was spent in my office, preparing for the chaos that would follow once the arrests were made public. I drafted press statements explaining my role as a victim rather than a participant, coordinated with my law firm's partners about the potential impact on our practice, and began the legal process of reclaiming my inheritance once the criminal case froze all fraudulent transactions. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Family dinner Sunday at the club. We need to discuss this situation before it gets out of hand." I stared at the message for a long moment, marveling at her ability to still think this was a situation that could be managed through family negotiation rather than federal prosecution. She had no idea that FBI agents were already preparing arrest warrants, that federal prosecutors were reviewing evidence, that their entire world was about to collapse around them. I typed back a simple response. "I won't be attending. You'll understand why very soon." Then I turned off my phone and sat in my office watching the sun set over the Willamette River, knowing that when it rose again, everything would be different. My family's empire of lies was about to crumble, and I would finally reclaim not just my inheritance but my grandfather's vision of justice without fear or compromise. The ocean doesn't forgive, and neither would federal law. My family was about to learn that some tides, once they turn, can never be reversed. The arrest warrants were executed at dawn on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide my family's history into before and after. I watched from my office window as news helicopters circled the Riverside Country Club, where federal agents had simultaneously raided both my parents' home and Preston's investment office. The carefully orchestrated operation had been planned to prevent any destruction of evidence or coordination between the conspirators. My phone had been ringing constantly since 6 a.m., but I'd let every call go to voicemail. Reporters, family friends, colleagues from the legal community, everyone wanted to know what I knew about the Hartwell family's spectacular fall from grace. The Portland Tribune's morning edition carried Kieran's exposé under a headline that made my stomach clench. Maritime fortune built on modern fraud. Portland investment family accused of multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. The article was devastating in its thoroughness, documenting not just Preston's financial crimes, but the social network he'd exploited to perpetuate them. Names I recognized from childhood dinner parties and country club events were listed as victims, their life savings evaporated by someone they'd trusted based on family connections and social standing. The betrayal extended far beyond what had been done to me. Agent Chen called at 10 a.m. to inform me that all 3 arrests had been completed without incident. Preston had been taken into custody at his downtown office, my father at the country club where he'd been having breakfast with potential investors, and my mother at their house while she was apparently shredding documents in the home office. The timing suggested they'd known the investigation was closing in and had been preparing for the worst. The arraignments are scheduled for this afternoon, Agent Chen explained. We'll need you to be available for testimony, but today will mostly be procedural. The real hearings will begin next week, once their attorneys have had time to review the evidence. I spent the rest of the morning fielding calls from my law firm's partners, who were understandably concerned about the impact of the scandal on our practice. Maritime law was a small, tight-knit community in Portland, and having a partner whose family was facing federal fraud charges created obvious complications for client relationships and professional credibility. Valerie, we've reviewed the evidence you provided to the FBI, and it's clear you're a victim rather than a participant, said managing partner Robert Sinclair during our emergency meeting. But we need to discuss how to handle the publicity and potential conflict of interest issues that may arise. The conversation was professional but tense, focusing on practical concerns about client retention and public perception rather than the personal devastation I was experiencing. My colleagues were supportive but cautious, recognizing that association with a major fraud case could damage the firm's reputation regardless of my innocence in the matter. By early afternoon, news of the arrests had spread throughout Portland's legal and business communities like wildfire. The federal courthouse was packed with reporters and photographers when I arrived for the arraignment hearings, their cameras flashing as I walked up the marble steps with Agent Chen and the prosecuting attorneys. Inside the courtroom, I got my first look at my family since learning the full scope of their crimes. Preston stood at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that made his usually polished appearance look shabby and defeated. His expensive haircut and manicured nails seemed ridiculous in the context of federal custody, and his confident demeanor had been replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed overnight. My parents sat with their attorney at a separate table, looking older and more fragile than I'd seen them in years. My mother's perfect posture had crumbled into a defeated slouch, and my father's commanding presence had diminished to the point where he looked like any other elderly man facing the destruction of everything he'd worked to build. The federal prosecutor outlined the charges with clinical precision: wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of federal securities law. The list seemed to go on forever, each count carrying potential prison sentences that would effectively mean life imprisonment for people in their 60s and 70s. Preston, at 42, faced the possibility of spending his best years behind bars if convicted on all counts. When the judge asked for pleas, all 3 defendants entered not guilty through their attorneys, but the evidence against them was so overwhelming that the pleas felt more like legal formalities than genuine claims of innocence. The bail hearing that followed was equally devastating, with the prosecutor arguing successfully that the defendants posed a flight risk due to their access to hidden assets and connections to international financial networks. Preston's bail was set at $5 million, my parents at $2 million each, amounts that would have been easily manageable a week earlier, but were now impossible given that all their assets had been frozen pending the outcome of the criminal case. They would remain in federal custody until trial, which was scheduled to begin in 6 months. As the defendants were led away in shackles, my mother caught my eye for the first time since entering the courtroom. The look she gave me was a mixture of betrayal, desperation, and something that might have been understanding. She knew I'd been the one to provide the evidence that had brought them down, but she also seemed to recognize that I'd had no choice once I'd discovered the scope of their crimes. The media circus outside the courthouse was exactly what I'd expected but hadn't fully prepared for. Reporters shouted questions about my role in the investigation, my relationship with my family, and my knowledge of the investment scheme. I walked through the crowd without comment, following the advice of the federal prosecutors who'd warned me that any public statements could complicate the ongoing case. That evening, I returned to my apartment to find it surrounded by news vans and photographers camped out on the sidewalk. The building's security kept them from entering the lobby, but I knew my privacy was effectively gone until the media lost interest in the story. I'd become a public figure by virtue of being the family member who'd exposed their crimes, and that attention would continue until the trials concluded. The weeks that followed blurred together in a succession of legal meetings, media requests, and attempts to return to some semblance of normal life. The maritime trust violation case proceeded in parallel with the criminal prosecution, with Pacific Luxury Developments discovering that they'd purchased not just illegally conveyed property, but an environmental liability that would cost them millions in federal fines. The developer's attorney called me repeatedly, trying to negotiate some kind of settlement that would allow them to retain at least partial ownership of the property. But the maritime trust provisions were absolute, with no room for compromise or partial compliance. They'd unknowingly entered into a contract that was void from the moment it was signed, and their only recourse was to sue my family for the return of their money. The property itself remained frozen in legal limbo while the various cases worked their way through the courts, but I knew it would eventually be returned to me once all the criminal and civil matters were resolved. My grandfather's legal protections had been even more thorough than I'd realized, creating multiple layers of insurance against exactly the kind of family betrayal that had occurred. 3 months after the arrests, Preston's attorney approached the federal prosecutors about a plea agreement. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that a trial would likely result in convictions on all counts, meaning decades in federal prison. A plea deal might reduce his sentence to 15 or 20 years, instead of the life imprisonment he faced if convicted at trial. The plea negotiations revealed additional details about the scope of the Ponzi scheme that hadn't been apparent. During the initial investigation, Preston had been stealing from investors for over 5 years, using increasingly sophisticated methods to hide the theft and maintain the appearance of profitable returns. The total amount stolen exceeded $12 million, with my inheritance, representing only a fraction of the funds he'd diverted to keep the scheme operational. My parents' involvement had been more extensive than even I'd realized, with both of them actively recruiting investors from their social network and using their reputation to lend credibility to Preston's fraudulent investment fund. They hadn't been passive enablers of his crimes. They'd been essential partners in executing them, using family gatherings and country club events as recruitment opportunities. The revelation that my parents had been so deeply involved in the scheme changed my perspective on their motivations for stealing my inheritance. It hadn't been a desperate attempt to help their son. It had been a calculated decision to protect their own financial interests by using my property to cover their investment losses. They'd sacrificed my future to preserve their own comfort, then attempted to destroy my credibility to prevent me from fighting back. As the plea negotiations continued, I found myself in the strange position of being consulted by federal prosecutors about appropriate sentences for my own family members. The government wanted my input as the primary victim of the property theft, and they were particularly interested in my perspective on whether my parents deserved leniency based on their age and supposed manipulation by Preston. Agent Chen, my parents weren't manipulated victims, I told her during one of our meetings. They were active partners in every aspect of these crimes. The property theft was just as much their idea as Preston's, and they would have continued the scheme indefinitely if it hadn't been exposed. The prosecutor taking notes nodded grimly. That's consistent with what we've found in the financial records. Your mother personally recruited at least 15 investors, and your father used his business connections to legitimize the fund with potential institutional investors. They were essential to the operation. The plea agreement that eventually emerged reflected the severity of their involvement. Preston would serve 22 years in federal prison and pay full restitution to all victims. My parents would each serve 12 years and forfeit all remaining assets to help compensate the people they'd defrauded. At their ages, the sentences effectively meant they would die in prison, a fact that wasn't lost on anyone involved in the negotiations. The day the plea agreements were signed, I stood in the same federal courthouse where my family's criminal enterprise had been exposed, watching them formally admit to crimes that had destroyed dozens of lives and betrayed every principle they'd claimed to represent. Preston spoke first, his voice barely audible as he acknowledged his guilt on all counts. My parents followed, their admissions even more painful to witness because of their obvious frailty and the certainty that they would never see freedom again. As part of the plea agreement, all fraudulently obtained assets were ordered returned to their rightful owners or sold to provide restitution to victims. The coastal property would be returned to me immediately, along with the portion of the sale proceeds that could be recovered from the frozen accounts. Pacific Luxury Developments would lose their entire investment, as the contract had been void from the beginning due to the maritime trust violations. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness that I hadn't anticipated. Justice had been served in the most complete way possible, with my inheritance returned and my family held accountable for their crimes. But the victory felt hollow given the human cost of their betrayal, not just to me, but to all the innocent people who'd trusted them with their life savings. The media attention continued for several more weeks as the story of the Hartwell family's fall from grace became a cautionary tale about white-collar crime and family betrayal. Editorial writers used the case to illustrate the dangers of Ponzi schemes and the importance of thorough due diligence in investment decisions. Business schools began using Preston's methods as examples of financial fraud techniques in their criminology courses. For me, the most difficult aspect of the aftermath was the social isolation that came with being the family member who'd exposed the crimes. Friends and acquaintances didn't know how to treat someone who'd sent their own parents to prison, even when those parents had committed serious crimes. The legal community was generally supportive, recognizing that I'd done the right thing under impossible circumstances, but social relationships became strained and uncomfortable. The coastal property was officially returned to my ownership 6 months after the plea agreements were signed, but it felt different walking through rooms where I'd learned to love the law and understand my grandfather's values. The knowledge that my own family had tried to steal it from me had tainted the memories associated with every corner of the estate. Standing in my grandfather's study, looking out at the Pacific Ocean through windows he'd gazed through for decades, I finally understood the full scope of what he'd been trying to protect when he'd created the Maritime Trust. It hadn't just been about preserving property or maintaining family wealth. It had been about ensuring that his values and principles would survive, even if future generations betrayed everything he'd tried to teach them. The legal documents he'd crafted with such care had done more than void an illegal sale or punish environmental violations. They'd preserved his legacy of integrity and justice in the face of family members who'd abandoned both concepts in pursuit of personal gain. His protections had been so thorough that not even the most elaborate criminal scheme could overcome them. As the sun set over the coastline that had shaped 4 generations of Hartwell family history, I made a decision that would define the next chapter of my life. The property would be preserved exactly as my grandfather had intended, But it would also become something more. A foundation dedicated to helping victims of financial fraud and family betrayal recover from the damage done to them by people they'd trusted. The Hartwell Maritime Foundation would use the resources my grandfather had protected to provide legal assistance, financial counseling, and emotional support to people whose lives had been destroyed by white-collar crime. It would be a living memorial to his belief that the law existed to protect the vulnerable from the powerful, and that family connections should never shield anyone from the consequences of betraying that trust. 2 years later, I stood on the wraparound porch of my grandfather's restored study, watching the sun rise over the Pacific while reviewing the quarterly reports from the Hartwell Maritime Foundation. The numbers told a story of healing and justice that would have made him proud. 43 families assisted in recovering stolen assets. 15 successful prosecutions of financial fraud initiated with our legal support, and over $2 million in restitution secured for victims of white-collar crime. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd initially envisioned when I'd first conceived it as a memorial to my grandfather's principles. What had started as a way to channel my anger and grief into something constructive had evolved into a nationally recognized resource for people whose lives had been shattered by financial betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's crimes had provided the resources to help other victims recover from similar devastation. The morning air carried the scent of salt and pine as I walked down to the beach where my grandfather had taught me to understand tidal patterns and maritime law. The developer's construction equipment was long gone, replaced by the natural landscape that had been preserved through his foresight and legal protections. The property looked exactly as it had during my childhood summers, a testament to the power of carefully crafted legal documents and unwavering principles. My phone buzzed with a call from Zara, who had become the Foundation's forensic accounting director after helping unravel my family's financial crimes. Her expertise in tracing hidden assets and complex fraud schemes had proven invaluable in assisting other victims who found themselves facing similar betrayals by trusted family members or business partners. "Val, we just received a case that's eerily similar to what happened to you," she said, her voice carrying the excitement that always accompanied a particularly challenging investigation. A woman in Seattle whose brother sold her inherited business to cover his gambling debts. The legal structure is different, but the family dynamics are almost identical. These calls had become routine over the past year as word spread about the Foundation's work. Victims of family financial abuse often felt isolated and ashamed, believing their situations were unique or that they somehow deserved the betrayal they'd experienced. The Foundation provided not just legal and financial assistance, but the emotional support that came from knowing others had survived similar devastation and rebuilt their lives. "Send me the details," I told Zara. "If we can help her recover the business and hold her brother accountable, it'll be worth whatever resources we need to invest." The Foundation's success had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies across the country, who increasingly consulted with us on complex financial fraud cases involving family members. The expertise we'd developed in untangling these emotionally charged situations had proven valuable to prosecutors, who often struggled with victims reluctant to testify against relatives. After ending the call with Zara, I walked back to the main house where renovations had transformed it into the Foundation's headquarters, while preserving the architectural character my grandfather had loved. The grand dining room where family gatherings had once celebrated success and status now hosted workshops for fraud victims learning to rebuild their financial lives. The elegant parlor where my parents had entertained potential investors for Preston's Ponzi scheme now served as a meeting space for support groups. The transformation of the space felt appropriate, given what I'd learned about my family's true character. Rather than preserving rooms that had witnessed so much deception and manipulation, I'd chosen to fill them with people working toward genuine healing and justice. The house had become what it should have always been, a place where vulnerable people could find protection and support. My assistant knocked on the study door, interrupting my review of the Foundation's annual report. "Ms. Hartwell, there's someone here to see you. She says she's a former client who wanted to thank you personally." The visitor turned out to be Margaret Chen, an elderly woman whose son had stolen her retirement savings to fund a failed restaurant venture. The Foundation had helped her recover most of the money through a civil lawsuit and had provided financial counseling to help her rebuild her security. She'd driven down from Portland specifically to express her gratitude in person. "I never thought I'd get my money back," she said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "But more than that, you helped me understand that what my son did wasn't my fault. I blamed myself for trusting him, for not being more careful with my finances. Your counselors helped me see that family members who betray that trust are the ones who should be ashamed, not their victims." These conversations were the most rewarding aspect of the Foundation's work, confirmation that our efforts were making a meaningful difference in people's lives. The financial recovery was important, but the emotional healing often proved more valuable in the long term. Too many victims of family financial abuse carried shame and self-blame that prevented them from moving forward even after recovering their losses. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Agent Chen, who had remained in touch since my family's prosecution concluded. The FBI had been tracking several investment schemes that used tactics similar to Preston's, and they wanted to consult with the Foundation about developing educational materials to help potential victims recognize warning signs before losing their savings. "The pattern is always the same," Agent Chen explained during our phone conversation. "Family members or close friends with legitimate business backgrounds who gradually escalate their requests for investment capital while maintaining the appearance of success and profitability. By the time victims realize they've been defrauded, the perpetrators have usually spent or hidden most of the money." The consultation work with law enforcement had become another important aspect of the Foundation's mission, helping to prevent financial crimes rather than simply assisting victims after the damage was done. We'd developed training materials for financial advisors, bank employees, and elder care professionals to help them identify potential fraud situations before life savings disappeared into criminal schemes. As evening approached, I found myself back in my grandfather's study, surrounded by the law books and maritime charts that had shaped my understanding of justice and responsibility. The room looked exactly as it had during my childhood, but my perspective on its significance had evolved considerably. It was no longer just a shrine to family history. It had become the command center for a mission that honored his values while addressing problems he couldn't have anticipated. The ringing phone interrupted my contemplation, displaying a number I recognized as the federal prison where Preston was serving his sentence. Inmates were allowed to make collect calls to family members, and my brother had been trying to reach me for months. I'd refused all his previous attempts, but something about the timing felt different tonight. "Valerie, thank you for accepting my call." Preston's voice was barely recognizable, stripped of the confidence and entitlement that had characterized his speech throughout our childhood. Prison had aged him in ways that went beyond simple physical deterioration. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I understand what I did to you, to all of us." The conversation that followed was unlike any interaction we'd ever had as siblings. Preston spoke with genuine remorse about the financial crimes he'd committed and the family relationships he'd destroyed in pursuit of covering up his failures. More importantly, he acknowledged that the property theft had been his idea, absolving our parents of the leadership role I'd attributed to them. "Mom and Dad were terrified when they found out about the SEC investigation," he admitted. "I convinced them that selling your inheritance was the only way to keep the family from losing everything. They didn't want to do it, but I made them believe they had no choice." The revelation reframed my understanding of my parents' motivations, though it didn't excuse their participation in the scheme or their attempts to discredit me when I'd discovered the theft. They'd chosen to trust Preston's judgment over my rights, and that decision had cost them their freedom, regardless of who had initiated the plan. I've been following the Foundation's work through news articles, Preston continued. What you've built from the wreckage of our crimes is more meaningful than anything our family accomplished in 4 generations. Grandfather would be proud of what you've done with his legacy. After ending the call, I sat in the darkening study processing this unexpected contact with the brother who had orchestrated my family's destruction. His acknowledgement of responsibility felt genuine, but it didn't change the consequences of his choices or resurrect the relationships his crimes had destroyed. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, regardless of the sincerity of subsequent apologies. The next morning brought news that would close another chapter in the aftermath of my family's crimes. Pacific Luxury Developments had finally exhausted their legal appeals and would be paying the full environmental penalties associated with their attempted development of the marine sanctuary property. The settlement would provide additional funding for the Foundation's work, while ensuring that no future development could threaten the coastal ecosystem my grandfather had worked to protect. The developer's legal team had spent 2 years trying to find some loophole in the maritime trust provisions that would allow them to recover their investment, but my grandfather's legal work had been too thorough to overcome. Every potential challenge had been anticipated and addressed in the original documents, creating a legal fortress that had withstood attacks from some of the most expensive lawyers in the Pacific Northwest. Standing on the beach that afternoon, watching waves crash against rocks that had witnessed a century of family history, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years ago, I'd been a successful attorney focused on shipping insurance disputes and routine maritime law cases. The discovery of my family's betrayal had transformed me into a victim's advocate and foundation director. Roles I'd never imagined, but that felt more meaningful than anything I'd accomplished. In traditional legal practice, the Foundation's work had also changed my perspective on the legal profession itself. Rather than viewing law as primarily a tool for protecting commercial interests or resolving business disputes, I'd learned to see it as a means of empowering people who had been harmed by those they trusted most deeply. The cases we handled were always personal, involving not just financial losses but the destruction of family relationships and the shattering of fundamental assumptions about human trustworthiness. My phone buzzed with a text message from Zara. The Seattle case just settled. Full recovery plus damages. Another family saved from financial ruin. These notifications had become the highlights of my days, confirmation that the Foundation was fulfilling its mission of helping victims rebuild their lives after devastating betrayals. Each successful case represented not just recovered money, but restored dignity for people who had been made to feel foolish or naive for trusting family members with their financial security. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that had inspired my grandfather's love of this coastline, I walked back toward the house that had become so much more than a family retreat. The building now represented hope for people whose lives had been shattered by financial fraud, a place where they could find the resources and support needed to rebuild what criminals had tried to destroy. The transformation of my inheritance, from a simple piece of coastal property into a foundation dedicated to justice and healing, felt like the culmination of everything my grandfather had tried to teach me about the purpose of law and the responsibility of privilege. He'd protected this land and these buildings not just for his descendants, but for the principles they could serve if his family proved worthy of that trust. Inside the study, I opened the old wooden box where I kept my grandfather's personal correspondence, including letters he'd written to me during law school that I'd rediscovered while settling his estate. His words seemed especially relevant now as I reflected on the path my life had taken since uncovering my family's crimes. "The law is not about winning or losing," he'd written in response to my complaints about a particularly difficult constitutional law class. "It's about ensuring that people who cannot protect themselves have someone willing to stand between them and those who would exploit their vulnerability. If you remember nothing else from your legal education, remember that your knowledge and skills are not possessions to be hoarded but tools to be used in service of justice." His words had guided every major decision I'd made since discovering the property theft, from the choice to cooperate with federal investigators to the decision to transform my inheritance into a resource for other victims. The foundation represented the practical application of his philosophy, using legal expertise and financial resources to protect people from the kind of family betrayal I'd experienced. The evening brought a call from a reporter working on a follow-up story about white-collar crime victims and their paths to recovery. She'd been tracking several high-profile cases, including mine, to understand how people rebuilt their lives after being betrayed by family members. Her questions focused on the emotional healing process rather than the legal or financial aspects of recovery. What would you tell someone who just discovered that their family has stolen from them? She asked near the end of our conversation. The answer came without hesitation, drawn from 3 years of working with victims and my own journey from devastation to purpose. I'd tell them that the betrayal they're feeling is real and justified, but it doesn't have to define the rest of their lives. The people who stole from them revealed their true character, but surviving that betrayal reveals yours. You get to choose whether you become bitter and withdrawn, or whether you use the experience to help others avoid the same devastation. After ending the interview, I walked through the Foundation's offices one final time before locking up for the evening. The converted rooms buzzed with the energy of people working toward meaningful goals, their dedication fueled by personal experience with the kind of financial trauma our clients face daily. Almost every staff member had been recruited after we'd helped them recover from their own family betrayals, creating a team united by shared experience and commitment to preventing others from suffering similar losses. The drive back to my Portland apartment took me along coastal highways that had been among my grandfather's favorite routes, winding roads that offered glimpses of the ocean between stands of old-growth forest. The landscape remained unchanged, despite everything that had happened, a reminder that some things endure regardless of human betrayal or institutional failure. Back in the city, I found my apartment building surrounded by the usual urban energy but felt disconnected from the commercial bustle that had once seemed so important. The Foundation's work had given me perspective on what actually mattered in life: relationships built on genuine trust, work that served purposes beyond personal advancement, and the satisfaction that came from using privilege and expertise to protect people who needed protection. Late that night, I received one final email that captured the essence of why the Foundation's work felt so meaningful. It came from a young man in Denver whose sister had embezzled from their family's business, leaving him responsible for debts he hadn't incurred while she disappeared with the profits. "I thought I was alone in this," he wrote. "I thought I must have done something wrong or been incredibly stupid to let my own sister destroy everything our grandparents built. Your Foundation's materials helped me understand that financial abuse by family members is more common than anyone talks about, and that the shame belongs to the perpetrators, not the victims. I'm not ready to ask for help yet, but knowing that it's available gives me hope that I can eventually rebuild my life." These messages arrived regularly from people across the country who had discovered that family members they trusted had been systematically stealing from them while maintaining facades of success and respectability. The isolation and shame they described were universal, but so was their capacity for recovery once they understood that others had survived similar betrayals and found ways to rebuild their lives with greater strength and wisdom. As I prepared for bed in my downtown loft, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that rainy October evening when I'd first discovered my family's theft of my inheritance. The betrayal that had initially felt like the end of everything important had actually been the beginning of work that felt more meaningful than anything I'd previously accomplished. My grandfather's coastal property had been preserved not just as a family retreat, but as headquarters for an organization dedicated to his deepest values. The legal protections he'd embedded in the Maritime Trust had prevented not just one act of theft, but had generated resources to help hundreds of other victims recover from similar betrayals. His foresight had created something more valuable than he could have imagined: a living memorial to the principle that law should serve justice, rather than simply protect the powerful. The foundation would continue growing, helping more families recover from financial betrayal while educating others about warning signs that could prevent such devastation. The work felt like a fitting tribute to a man who had spent his career protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit their trust, and it had given meaning to my own experience of family betrayal that I never could have anticipated. Sometimes the most devastating losses become the foundation for the most meaningful victories. My family had tried to steal my inheritance and destroy my reputation, but their crimes had ultimately revealed my true calling and provided the resources to pursue it. They had intended to diminish me, but they had actually freed me to become someone my grandfather would have been proud to call his granddaughter. The ocean doesn't forget the storms that shape its coastlines, but it transforms their destructive power into something beautiful and enduring. I had learned to do the same with my family's betrayal, using their destruction to build something that would outlast all of us and serve people they had never cared enough to consider. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.